Arcus, 27. Most of the fiction featuring Hattie and Jordan end with one of the siblings disappearing, which accounts for some of the contradicting memories I've discovered in the fog. I believe there are several actual Hatties and Jordans stuck here with all the others. The memories I've studied so far conflict with one another so that they rarely line up with each other or the fictional stories I found in the Chamber of Blood. However, I must always remember that the collected stories and artwork in the chamber are interpretive. They are not exact, and they were more or less inspired by several versions of the siblings that exist, or will exist, or have existed within the endless tapestry that is the Omniverse. The truth is, the unknowns have collected so many stories that I don't know where to begin my research. Currently, I am focusing on the Red Crane and 12 to Midnight to better understand how the Black Fog works and how the characters in these stories may have been able to interact with it to their advantage. There are also many versions of déjà vuism that relate a story of how one man found a way into the darkest recesses of this dimension to save the one he loved. But the story doesn't go into the details of how he managed to find a way in, and I will have to go through other versions of the story to see if there is any information that can help me. Better yet, I am hoping to find his actual memories within the fog, to give me a sense of how he found a way into this realm. Chamber of Blood, Day of Night, Mahan Singh, 1. Mahan Singh spent 17 years amassing a fortune for his estranged niece by leading mercenary missions all over the world for Leviathan Securities. A decorated soldier in the Indian Army, Mahan was discharged after 13 years of service for disobeying orders while on assignment for the United Nations. Shortly afterward, he joined Leviathan and found himself on a series of strange assignments that involved securing haunted locations and procuring strange artifacts of an occult nature. Locations and artifacts that seemed worthless, but were of grave importance to governments and organizations for some reason or another. Mahan didn't know what to make of it. To him, it all felt like a kind of invisible war between secret societies that were somehow able to use governments and corporations like pieces on a chessboard for a bunch of old, moldy books and geometric trinkets from forgotten civilizations. Now Mahan was pinned behind a crumbling wall in a village in the outskirts of Nairobi, Kenya, with his fallen units scattered in pieces all over the surrounding dirt roads. He had been fighting all day against different units and was fresh out of luck and ammunition. "There's no way out of here," he told himself. "I've got no support, no ammunition, no luck." "Why do you need luck when you have a weapon and your wits? You've been in worse situations and survived. Think you were beaten, and you were beaten. I am beaten. You are almost beaten, and that's not the same thing." Suddenly, Mahan heard the surrounding mercenaries yelling at one another in Russian. They were planning an attack and coordinating with one another. He peeked around the corner, then ducked fast as several rounds punched holes into the wall, sending clouds of dust and stone into the air. He cursed in Punjabi, grabbed his automatic rifle, then craned his head ever so slightly to see fast-moving silhouettes against the full moon, closing in on his position. Quickly, he crawled into a nearby home and hid the asset, the ancient scroll, underneath several corpses of British agents he had killed just before the Russians had decided to join their party. Then he hid in the shadows, holding his rifle by the barrel, refusing to die without a fight. "They probably all work for the Collector," he told himself. "Crazy rich man with too much time and money on his hands. Shaw just wants to make sure he gets the scroll before another eccentric billionaire beats him to it. And from where does this prize come? It supposedly comes from a lost elder civilization with advanced and forbidden knowledge. Nonsense, all of it. A bunch of ancient stories about pagan priests and barbaric rituals and cosmic deities told around a campfire. Ancient sci-fi at best." Taking a deep breath, Mahan heard their almost inaudible footfalls before he saw them. His eyes narrowed, and his face hardened as two mercs entered the moonlit doorway. With a groan, he launched himself into the air, smashing the butt of his rifle against one head and then the other. Both mercs collapsed to the ground, unconscious. A split second later, Mahan yanked a loaded rifle from the hands of one of the fallen mercs and rushed through the doorway, taking cover behind a well spilling over with thick, buzzing flies like living black soup. Inside the well were the rotting bodies of those who had sought the scroll but had found death instead. Mahan buried his nose in his arm and suppressed an instinct to retch. Then, seeing a merc, he lifted his rifle and pulled the trigger. Bullets tore holes through the neck and face as the mercenary staggered back and forth, then fell against a wagon with the pulpy head hanging by a shred of flesh. As he searched the shadows for other mercs, Mahan suddenly heard the crunch of stone behind him. He whirled to fire, a second too late. Several rounds pounded into his Kevlar vest like a jackhammer, sending him stumbling backward into the black soup of death. A moment later, the surviving mercs loomed over the mouth of the well as a thick black fog coiled around them like a snake. Taking a deep breath, Mahan closed his eyes and waited for a death that never came. Instead of a report ripping through the darkness like a clap of thunder, he heard a scream, followed by a cry and then shrieks of agony. When he opened his eyes, the mercs were gone, as though they had been erased by the fog. Mahan struggled through the putrid blood and fluids to climb up and out of the well. As he pulled himself over the gore-covered mouth, he noticed the world had been plunged into an abyss of fog. Before he could make any sense of what was happening, something snatched his ankle hard and tried to pull him back down. Desperately, Mahan gripped the edge of the well and held on tightly. He looked to his feet where he saw multiple hands yanking and clutching at his legs. He held on for dear life, but his hands slipped in the blood and gore and soon gave way. With a terrible cry, he fell back into the gore as bony hands clawed at his legs, his arms, his throat, his beard, his nose, his turban, and pulled him deeper and deeper into the darkness. Needles of pain burst inside his head as he drowned in thick fermenting blood. He knew with a strange resignation that he was dying, or that he was already dead, and that he would never know his niece or what had become of her. After his wife and parents had died in a plane crash and his brother had disappeared, she was the only one left. She was his only family, and he swore he would always take care of her. But then life happened, and in the end he had only taken care of himself. He had lived a lonely, selfish life, counter to his upbringing and his beliefs. He was a walking contradiction who had somehow convinced himself that he was cursed, that everyone he had ever loved died or disappeared, and that he was doing his niece a favor by staying out of her life. He had somehow convinced himself that he was keeping his bad luck away from her, while he amassed a fortune that he would one day leave her. But Mahan knew it was all a lie. He didn't know the first thing about nurturing and raising a human being. Raising his brother's daughter terrified him, and that's why he had clung to any reason he could to abandon her. All he knew was killing and destroying in the name of governments and corporations. And as the darkness swallowed him whole, Mahan realized in horror that killing and destroying was all he would ever know. Mahan had failed his ancestors, he had failed his family, he had failed his brother and his niece. He would never know her hopes, her dreams, her likes or dislikes. He would know nothing, except the inky blackness that swept over his eyes and the unnameable terrors that awaited him in the great unknown. Mahan opened his eyes with a start. He was still in the well, submerged in the putrid death stew, staring up at thick black fog drifting over him, as he heard a whirring sound, the sound of a motor accelerating and decelerating somewhere in the distance. He took a moment to gather his senses. He didn't remember much. He remembered being shot, stumbling back, and falling into the well. Everything after that moment felt like a nightmare that had been inspired by one of his father's stories. The one where unarmed, peaceful protesters were shot dead and stuffed into a well. and left to rot in the blistering Punjab heat. With a painful groan, Mahan reached out with trembling hands to a jutting rock, and with difficulty pulled himself free from the gore. Rock by rock, he climbed his way up the festering throat of the well and finally pulled himself over the mouth and into the thick black fog. A cry sounded over the incessant whir of the machine, and Mahan quickly realized he wasn't in Kenya anymore. He stood and took in his surroundings. There were strange structures like factories submerged in the fog. Scattered around the structures were piles of clothes and bodies set ablaze. Above in the pale red sky, crows circled and cawed, adding to the oppressive cacophony. "Help, please." Mahan heard a woman crying for help coming from a bank of fog. Snapping out of his daze, he extended his hands and waved a tunnel through the fog, searching for the source of the sound. "Help, someone, please." The disembodied voice reached him again, and she somehow seemed close and far at the same time. He froze to listen carefully, but all he could hear was the incessant whirring of the motor accelerating and decelerating. "Help." There it was again. He moved left, then right, and finally he reached a woman in pilot fatigues, stuck in a trap of twisted barbed wire. Without a word, he pulled the metal thorns out of her legs as she winced and squirmed in pain with every movement. "I don't know what happened or how I ended up here." Her voice trailed away, and she seemed bewildered. "What's the last thing you remember?" Mahan asked as he struggled with the barbed wire. The pilot stumbled back and answered with intermittent groans as she nursed her wounds. "I was on patrol, soaring through clear blue skies, when this black cloud suddenly appeared, and then the plane began to shake and break apart, and I don't know. I was here." A sudden click, and they both turned wide-eyed to face the barrel of a rifle. Behind the rifle, a man in black fatigues appraised them. "Who the fuck are you two?" Mahan raised a hand. "Wait, careful. We're not a threat. We're just as confused as you." "Who are you and what are you doing in Texas? Are you CIA? Is this some kind of test?" Mahan gritted his teeth. "This ain't a test, and I'm pretty sure this ain't Texas." "Who are you?" The agent shoved his rifle in Mahan's face. But before Mahan could answer, a Japanese woman in a black and red kimono emerged from the fog, unsheathing a katana with a high-pitched ring. She yelled at them in Japanese, and Mahan extended a calming hand to her. "Please, put the sword down." He then turned to the agent. "Please, put the gun down. Let's figure this out." "Who are you?" the agent yelled, pushing the muzzle in Mahan's face. "I won't ask again." "I can tell you who I am, but that's not the question, is it?" "Yeah. What's the question, then?" "Where?" Mahan said flatly, motioning to the destroyed factories, the craters, and the smoldering piles of trash and bodies. "I should think the question is, where? Where are we?" Another voice came from behind. "He's right, you know." Mahan turned to watch a man with a police jacket emerge from the fog. "We're still trying to figure that one out. But right now, we should all be asking, how?" "How?" Mahan repeated. "Yes," the detective said. "How much time do we have before the horror finds—" Before he could finish his sentence, a shriek, followed by a high-pitched whine, startled them. A moment later, a mass of melded humanity and machine came at them. Mahan could make out several heads, all shrieking battle cries in different languages, attached to a patchwork of charred scraps from missiles, tanks, fighter jets, and nuclear submarines, all bearing flags and strange logos of brands from different periods he vaguely remembered. He stared at this monstrous chimera in shock and wasn't quite sure what he was looking at. "The horror," he called it. Looks more like the embodiment of war. Sponsored war. Mahan swallowed a thickness growing in his throat as the horror rushed the stunned agent and tore his head off, swallowing the terrified face and dripping neck like a ripe cherry. Then its ghastly mouth opened wide, and a stream of fire torched the jerking headless corpse as it collapsed into a heap of industrial garbage. Not waiting to be next, the samurai lunged at the monstrosity, and with incredible speed and precision, cut it to pieces. Then all of them watched in disbelief as the pieces of flesh and metal slowly disintegrated into the living fog. The detective sighed. "It will be back," he said, appraising the samurai. 18th or 19th century, Red Crown clan. You're not the first. We could definitely use your skills here. The samurai sheathed her katana and grasped at the fog as though trying to capture pieces of it to study, as though she recognized it. Mahan approached the detective. "Where exactly is here?" But the detective didn't answer. He merely turned his back on them and walked away, saying, "Follow me, if you want to escape." Mahan took in a deep breath and gathered his senses. Then he took to his heels and followed the detective into the unknown with the samurai and the fighter pilot in tow. Mahan followed the detective through a labyrinth of bombed-out factories and mountains of garbage set ablaze. At the center of this industrial hell was a giant machine with hooks and cameras and television screens of every possible brand and size, broadcasting moments of Mahan's life, as though his brain was a Wi-Fi signal that could stream his memories, his darkest memories. And not just his memories, but the memories of the samurai, the pilot, and the detective. It was as though they had been selected by some unnameable and incompressible intelligence for mere entertainment. The detective stopped when he reached what seemed to be a submarine hatch, surrounded by a pile of smoldering trash and mangled, charred bodies. "Get in," he yelled, opening the hatch. "I'll explain what I know when we're safe." "Where does it lead?" Mahan asked. "Away from here," the detective said, "and that's all you should care about right now. We don't have time for explanations, but when we're safe, Ben will answer all your questions as best he can. Right now, you need to—" A clanking noise suddenly interrupted him. "Go, go, go!" the detective yelled as the horror came at them from the shadows. Instantly, he pulled out his flashlight, distracting the horror as Mahan and the others escaped down the hatch. Arcus, 34. There are countless horror stories about mist or fog in the chamber, and not all of them are related to the entity. The unknowns have done an adequate job at separating the relevant from the irrelevant stories, making my research on what others have written about this place and experience easier to conduct. What is it about the fog, and not just black fog, that has inspired so many stories throughout the Omniverse? Chamber of Blood, 12 to midnight, dark age to come. The sound of a bottle clanging against the ground greeted Hattie as she entered the half-burned building that had gone up in flames nearly a week ago. Thick, smoky air stung her nose as she stepped over shards of glass and heaps of charred wood. Bright city lights spilled through the shattered windows and crumbling walls. Carefully, Hattie picked her way across the floor toward the elevator, where she found the door leading to the stairs. A sign on the door warned her that the entire structure would be demolished in the morning. There's still time, she thought as she ascended the narrow stairs. I've got a few hours to convince Max that he's not crazy, that he's not losing his grip on reality, and that something is happening to our world, something only a few of us can see and feel. Hattie reached the last door at the top of the stairs and pushed her way onto the roof. There she spotted a man sitting on the ledge with thick, tangled hair and a weathered army jacket, drinking himself to oblivion as he stared out at the bright lights of the city. She approached him slowly and he didn't react or even turn to regard her when she sat down beside him. She merely sat in silence, listening to the police sirens wail in the distance over the horns and the muffled music coming from the clubs and bars below. At last she said, "I thought I'd find you here." Max took a few swallows of rum. "I don't know you." "But I know you, Maxwell." "I don't care where you're from. I don't want to talk." "Yes, I can see that. You want to drink." "Perceptive," he said sarcastically, then extended the bottle toward her. "You're welcome to join." "No, thank you, Mr. Holt." "How do you know my name?" "I know much more about you, Max." "You CIA? FBI? "If I were, you'd already be dead," Hattie said. "You were an Olympic biathlon athlete. You were a soldier. Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. You left the military after an incident, and after that you kind of pulled yourself off the grid." "You know how to use a search engine. You get a gold medal. Now leave me alone to my quiet time." Max raised the bottle and took another swig. Hattie narrowed her eyes and looked to the shadows on the roof beyond him. She couldn't see anything, but she could hear disembodied voices talking to him. She shut them out, then leaned closer to him. "I know you see and hear things others can't. I know they follow you. I know you want them to stop. And I didn't get all that from a search engine." Max lowered the bottle from his lips and fixed his gaze on a couple arguing on the sidewalk below. "You don't know what I hear, what I see." "Things from another place, another world, another realm." Max swallowed a growing lump in his throat. Hattie paused, then continued. "Something otherworldly attacked your unit, and you survived because of your abilities, and now no one believes a word of it. You were ridiculed, discharged, and silenced with an endless supply of opioids to fog your memory and neutralize your questions." Hattie stopped as his eyes filled with tears. "You're not crazy, Max. You saw what you saw, and no drug or drink in the world will relieve the guilt or stop the nightmares. And that's why you're here, isn't it? Waiting for morning to make it all stop." Max cleared his throat. "What do you want?" "Your skills and abilities on my team." "And what team is that?" "The one that is trying to stop the end of the world." Max laughed uproariously, then stopped at once. "You're serious?" Hattie grabbed the bottle out of his hands, took a swig, handed it back to him, and nodded gravely. Max shook his head. "What do you know about what happened to my unit?" "Not much," Hattie admitted. "What I do know is there are some very powerful people who have the answers, or think they have the answers you're looking for. What I do know is that since I was a teen, I've been caught in the crossfire between two warring groups that need people like us to access this other realm and bring things back. I've been running from them for the last 40 years, and I've helped others like us from suffering an unknown fate at their cruel hands." Max's face hardened. "They laughed at me. They said something in me snapped, and that I had imagined the fog and the creatures that came out of it." Hattie shook her head. "You didn't imagine anything. I lost my brother in the same way." They exchanged a look. "He's not dead. I can still hear him. I do. But I can't see him." "Where is he?" Hattie shrugged. "I don't know. All I know is we're not the only ones who lost friends and loved ones to this phenomenon. And if we work together, we might one day see them again." Max laughed and pulled on his bottle. "So you're recruiting me? Is that what you're doing? Recruiting me in some kind of paranormal army?" He laughed again in disbelief. Hattie watched him laugh. "I'm giving you what you need." "And what is that?" "A second chance," Hattie answered flatly. "Purpose, meaning, A chance to save others from being murdered or used by the same assholes who are coming for you right now as we speak." Max laughed. "What are you talking about? Who's coming for me?" "I have a list." Hattie broke off abruptly. She pulled out a gun from her jacket and shot 2 dim figures in the head as they emerged from the exit door. She then jerked to her feet and hurried to the bodies, searching their jackets for IDs without any success. "There'll be more," she said, looking up at Max as he stepped beside her with wide, confused eyes. "You're at the top of their list, and that's why I'm here." "What list? What are you talking about?" "Follow me," Hattie said, "and I'll explain everything." Max nodded, dropped his bottle with a loud clang, and followed Hattie down the stairs, through the charred building, and out into the alley where a cab was waiting for them. Max Holt stood in the basement of the Park and Sherwood bookstore, examining a wall of pictures, notes, and numbers, covered by a web of red string highlighting connections. He narrowed his gaze on hundreds, if not thousands, of missing people from all over the world. Tacked between the pictures and notes were transcripts of horror stories from various podcasts, decoded into numbers and coordinates. He then glanced around the room and noticed artifacts and artworks from ancient civilizations he did not recognize from any history book he had ever read, and he had read many. He turned back to the wall and noticed for the first time a picture of his unit in Afghanistan, among countless other units that were missing in action. His face grew stern, his eyes narrowed, and he turned to Hattie and asked, "Is this the list?" Hattie stepped beside him. "This is the list of those we failed." Her eyes fixed on a picture of her brother at a World War II Zeppelin crash site in the French Alps, where they had recovered several wonder weapons that a secret unit of German soldiers was transporting for the Thule Society. It was the last time she had seen him before he had disappeared. "The list is of those that are being targeted by some very powerful and disturbed elites. They will either be killed in ritual sacrifice, or they will be used as tools to search areas that overlap with another dimension." "I don't understand." "I know. It's a lot to take in. But these groups, they communicate through random podcasts and deliver encoded messages in stories and media, and we do our best to decode them." Max scoffed. "Is this some kind of joke? Codes in stories? That's your list?" Hattie shook her head. "This is real. There are people who are in serious danger, and you can help them. You left the government because they laughed and ridiculed you. That won't happen with us. We know what you saw is real." Max approached the picture of his unit. "I've got names and places and endless funds at my disposal," she said. "We're 12 to midnight, and only a few of us know it. And I need you on our team, not theirs." "Minutes?" "Seconds. 12 seconds." "These groups," Max queried, "are they that powerful?" "You have no idea." Max extended his hand, touching the picture of his unit. He then followed a red string to a passage culled from a horror story. From the passage, he followed yet another string to a series of numbers, the time, day, and place the creatures in the fog attacked them. Hattie stepped away and soon returned with a folder, pulling out a picture of an abandoned cemetery in Chile, along with a picture of a man. She handed the pictures to Max, and he stared at them for a long, thoughtful moment, before nodding that he would join her team. Chamber of Blood. Rabbits attack hiker in Colorado. A hiker is in critical condition after being bitten by a dozen rabbits that escaped the Ascendic Research Institute, an emergency responder said Friday. The hiker was bitten in the legs and face near Misty Lake, said National Park Ranger Steve Downer. The hiker's condition was unknown Friday, but doctors are optimistic. Chamber of Blood. The Red Crane. Veil of Blood. 1. Several paths led to the harbor where peasants and merchants had witnessed the strange appearance of a foreign ship. They discussed the ship and the arrival in the surrounding villages with mingled anger, fear, and curiosity. Most believed the foreigners were here to disseminate contraband and rob their beloved land of precious artifacts. Many believed a band of thieves was selling these precious goods to these foreigners in exchange for their weapons. Some even claimed that they had seen these thieves on the gangway, loading stolen artifacts and relics from fallen lords and noble families onto their ship. Saku Nakano stood in the moonlight, considering her options. There was the long and safe route along the dirt road, and there were shorter routes through the dark and deadly woods, where many unlucky villagers had been killed by creatures, it was said, not of this world. Saku knew of these cursed places all too well. She had lost her entire clan to these mist-enshrouded areas over the years, and now she roamed the country, the last of the Red Crown clan, seeking out the great corruption that was upon her people, finishing what her clan had started centuries ago. The enemies to her clan, the Black Serpent Society, served a 9-headed serpent made of black mist. They believed the Black Serpent would grant them powers and boons beyond human comprehension in this world and the next, in exchange for unquestioning devotion. They were convinced that the Black Mist Serpent was a demon that slithered through these wooded, cursed areas, creating doorways into what they called the belly of the serpent, or just the belly. Saku turned toward the dark woods, and sensing raw evil in her midst, she prepared to enter, thinking about the hushed conversations she had overheard in the nearby markets. She remembered the merchant hacking and gutting fish as he talked to a woman who was going through a bag of oysters she had just gathered in the sea. She remembered them talking about how they had seen bandits with pistols and gunpowder, and other strange weapons. I remember them mentioning the foreigners, she thought. They said they were Dutchmen. They were on the wharf, speaking fluent Japanese with unknown merchants in plain kimonos, with the exception of a strange serpent crest. They described the crest as a 9-headed serpent, twisted in a circular knot as it chased its 9 tails. They described only a few sailors, and how most of the crew had perished of an unnamed disease during the voyage across the ocean. A sudden laugh interrupted her thoughts. "Where is your husband?" A man in a plain brown kimono looked her up and down in the pearly light of the moon as he approached her. Saku met his gaze, but did not react or respond. The man placed his hand lightly on the hilt of his sword as he continued to appraise her. She was tall and lean, with strong, sinuous arms and piercing dark eyes. She had long, black-oiled hair gathered in a perfect queue, doubled over and tied neatly with a red and white sash. She wore thong sandals and a simple black kimono. A vibrant red sash around her waist held 2 scabbard swords. One sword was short and straight. The other was long and curved at the tip. "Where are your papers?" The man edged closer to her with dim recognition in his eyes. He had heard rumors of an Onimusha in a black and red kimono roaming the land, destroying the wicked while protecting those who could not protect themselves. Or did she roam the land seeking justice for her butchered clan? Or was she a bandit leader who raided and pillaged villages? The man couldn't quite remember what he had heard, and he had forgotten the name people had given her. It was related to her clan and its origin. That much he knew, but not much more. It would have helped if he had paid closer attention when his wife had been discussing her many adventures with her sisters. But he had ignored most of the stories as exaggerated gossip and legends, not unlike that other samurai that everyone called a demon. There was no such thing as a demon samurai, and there was certainly no such thing as a woman samurai that could perform all the feats the stories claimed she had performed. Saku breathed deeply and placed her hand near the hilt of her long sword.
"Do you not see I am addressing you? Where are your papers? Answer me,
With impossible speed, Saku whirled her sword in a gleaming silver arc, and the man's torso toppled off his hips, and a fountain of warm crimson fed the ground. The twisted mouth twitched as it sputtered bile and blood and tried to make out the words, "Red Crane." He had remembered, a moment too late. Returning her sword to its scabbard, Saku sighed and said an inward prayer for the brute. Then she stepped over his jerking torso and entered the belly of the serpent. With careful, silent steps, Saku pushed smoothly through the belly, paying close attention to the lurking black mist slithering through gnarled trees that seemed to shift and waver with her every step, as though to intimidate her. "Don't make a sound," she thought, stepping down a slope through noiseless shadows toward the sound of waves crashing against rocks. She was close to the wharf. She could smell the seaweed, fish, and salt in the air. There was also something else, a strange heaviness in the atmosphere. Staring up through the shaking canopy, she saw thick clouds marching across the sky. She sensed the floor moving and looked down to see her legs completely submerged in the creeping mist. A moment later, a branch cracked not 10 paces away, and she knew she wasn't alone anymore. Saku neither ran nor hid. She froze, closed her eyes, listening carefully for threats approaching through the black mist that heaved and moved as though it were alive. Saku knew she was somehow, as difficult as it was to explain, in 2 worlds at once, and she knew there were demons and monsters in the other world that hunted within these overlapping areas. Saku didn't know much about this other world. What she knew, she had learned from her mother and father. The Black Serpent Society, they had once explained, believed the Black Mist Serpent was a living deity that consumed people, towns, civilizations, and worlds. The Black Serpent Society believed that within the belly there was lost knowledge and power from all these consumed worlds that could help them usher in a golden age of peace, prosperity, and abundance. Their dedication, their devotion, their ritualistic killings were, in the end, for the betterment of humanity. The Red Crown clan, however, believed the promise of a golden age was nothing more than a cosmic ruse, a shiny gold lure to snag minnows, fish, and whales in the abyss. With a deep breath, Saku sensed the threats were gone. She opened her eyes and continued through wavering light and shadow as the wind began to pick up and the mist grew thicker. But then she stopped suddenly when she heard a familiar roar. A thunderous roar that seemed to shake the world. This time, she didn't close her eyes. She didn't run. This time, she silently lowered herself by a tree as she heard the pounding footfalls of a giant samurai in shiny green and gold armor approaching. She heard him smashing bushes and trees with his kanabo as he searched for her in the shadows. She knew without seeing him that she was being hunted by the samurai that had been corrupted and turned into a demon by the Black Mist Serpent. Her sister had told her many tales about this samurai, how he had once been a man of honor and conviction, how he had hunted and executed corrupt merchants and false samurai, how peasants and villagers began calling him a demon because of his savage methods, and how he had ultimately been turned into the very thing he hated most, the very thing the stories depicted him as, the Oni Samurai. The very same Oni her sister savagely battled long ago when they had been caught in the mist. She had escaped, her sister hadn't, and now all she wanted to do was take down this demon and make him tell her where she was. But Saku knew better than to lose herself in the past. She pushed the memory of her sister out of her thoughts and instantly found her focus. She looked through a gap in the trees toward the wharf, where she saw orange specks of light against the wall of darkness that was the sea. She could make it. She could outrun him to a place where he could not follow. Looking over her shoulder, Saku saw the giant samurai only 10 paces away. He was decked in shiny gold and green armor and carried around his back a massive leather bag dripping thick blood at the bottom. A few heads jutted out of the bag, and clouds of buzzing flies surrounded him. The Oni searched the trees and bramble and was now only 7 paces away. Unexpectedly, something jerked away from a bush, and he launched at the creature and smashed it with his kanabo, losing his bag in the attack. The bag fell, and dozens of heads rolled toward her. One head stopped at her feet and stared at her with wide-open eyes. Saku gasped as she suddenly realized she was staring at her own face. She fixed her gaze at the other heads in the mist and thought that they all seemed to resemble her, as though this demon samurai had already decapitated her countless times before. None of it made sense. Impossible, she thought. It cannot be, and yet it is. Have I fallen to the demon before? Are there others like me in the demon world that made him? But look, a scar. Saku observed the head at her feet and noticed a long scar on the side of her face. She instinctively felt her own cheek where the scar should have been. It was proof that this was someone else, though she could not deny the resemblance was uncanny. Saku swatted flies and reached for the head to get a closer look, but then she suddenly froze when she heard a terrifying roar not 5 paces behind her. In one fluid motion, she dove into a thicket as the kanabo missed its mark. Without a moment to spare, she scrambled to her feet and turned just in time to see a gore-covered kanabo with the crushed head of a rabbit coming down on her with devastating speed. Quickly, she sidestepped and withdrew her sword. An instant later, she slashed off the demon's arm with a roar of her own. But knowing the arm would grow back in the mist, she turned and charged away, desperately running for the beach. She had downed the demon before, but somehow it always managed to rise unscathed to continue the hunt. There was no defeating the demon. There was only one option: escape. As she rushed through the woods, she turned back to see the demon chasing after her. She pushed herself to run faster and faster, and just as the demon lunged at her again, she dove out of the mist through a break in the trees to a place he could not follow. The demon samurai stopped suddenly and watched her closely. Saku clambered to her feet, brushing off sand, seaweed, and salt. She turned to face the edge of the woods where she saw red glowing eyes fade into the night. Then she heard the crunch of rocks behind her, followed by a clicking sound. She turned slowly to face the barrel of a musket pistol glinting in the moonlight.